I'm Doug Farrer, and this is The World Unpacked.
Peace talks between delegations from Ukraine and Russia are underway in Turkey.
As tensions rise between Ukraine and Russia, Turkey is caught in the middle. Turkish
Recep Tayyip Erdogan, though diplomatically closer to Russia in recent years, went on to firmly condemn its invasion of Ukraine.
The military operation launched early this morning against Ukraine's territory, unacceptable, and we reject it.
As Ukrainian forces hold out against the might of the Russian army, diplomacy is breaking out in Istanbul. Russian and Ukrainian officials, and even a famous Russian oligarch, have traveled to Turkey to try to negotiate a possible end to the war in Ukraine. But why did they pick Turkey? It's a nation caught between the desire for a good relationship with Russia and its NATO membership, part European, part Asian. Here to explain Turkey's unique role in the Ukraine crisis is Alper Coşkun, a former career diplomat in Turkey's Foreign Service, who is now a senior fellow in Carnegie's Europe program. Here we go. Alper, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you for having me.
So before we dive in, I want to hear a little bit about your career. I mean, you were a senior diplomat in the Turkish Foreign Service. Now you're here with us at Carnegie. Tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, I spent a little over 30 years as a diplomat with the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I had bilateral and multilateral postings. My first posting was actually in Moscow right after the breakup of the Soviet Union in 92. I spent 3 years there, and then I was in Athens, multilateral posts at the UN and at NATO, and I was the Turkish ambassador in Azerbaijan for 4 years between 2012 and 2016. The end of that brought me to Turkey. I was the DG for International Security Affairs, dealing predominantly with NATO, Euro-Atlantic affairs. And then the opportunity at Carnegie came up, and since then, since 2021, since last year, after retiring from the Foreign Ministry, I joined the team at Carnegie, and here I am.
Moscow, NATO, Greece, they really gave you all the easy jobs, huh?
I think I was privileged. I had some good postings. They were all challenging in their own way, but each really rewarding. I enjoyed that. It was a fantastic experience.
Great. So let's get into the topic of the day. Can you lay out for us what Turkey's key objectives are with respect to the war in Ukraine?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, it might be important to make the point that Turkey called a spade in the context of the war on Ukraine. From day one, it did refer to Russia's action as a war. It condemned, together with over 140 nations at the UN General Assembly, Russia's action. So it stood very much by Ukraine and together with its NATO and European allies. When this war did break out, one thing had changed. Turkey's relations with the Russian Federation had intensified on a number of fronts. This is a very complex relationship. I mentioned some theaters where Turkey and Russia have been cooperating. Syria is the foremost that comes to mind, but it's more than that. Also Libya and even in the Southern Caucasus, where in most instances Turkey and Russia are pitted against each other in their overall objectives. But they have managed, particularly through a relationship that President Erdogan and President Putin have been able to establish throughout the years of trust to manage their differences. And this war, the war in Ukraine, came at a most unfortunate time for Turkey, both in terms of the economic realities and the challenges that the Turkish economy was facing, not only because of the fact that it was reeling from COVID like every other nation, but also because of some unorthodox policies that had created additional fragility for the Turkish economy. And of course, as a regional power, seeing this sort of instability, a state of war in the region, is something that Turkey did not want. And that put Turkey in a position where it probably, compared to a lot of other nations, had an increased incentive, if you will, to bring an end to the war as soon as possible. And the fact that Turkey had a good standing in Kiev and was able to retain a relative state of understanding with Moscow, put Turkey in a position where both Russia and Ukraine seemed to be ready to continue their talks, which, as you know, had started out in Belarus. And that brought the parties to Turkey, first in Antalya and then more recently in Istanbul.
I really have to dig into the relationship Turkey has with Russia, because Russia is a state that has especially recently under Putin, drawn some really clear lines about who's quote unquote good and who's bad, right? They're close with a no limits partnership to China. The West is sort of trying to bring down Putin and corrupt their society. Even in Ukraine, obviously, Putin's saying that it's controlled by Nazis and drug users. Turkey has been on the other side of battlefields from the Russians, not only recently, but traditionally in history and throughout centuries. It's a member of NATO. It's really close geographically to Russia, and has hosted American nuclear weapons. As recently as 2015, Turkey shot down a Russian jet. Yet somehow this relationship between Erdogan and Putin seems to remain at least somewhat friendly. How is this possible?
I think that's a great question, and it's really very complex. But I think one of the realities one has to understand is that seeming inconsistencies of this nature, for example, a NATO member country like Turkey engaging with the Russian Federation in this type of a relationship, it may be a seeming inconsistency, but it's also a regional reality. And it's not just about President Erdogan. I think historically, despite the fact, obviously, as you mentioned, that Turkey and Russia have a history of wars and being on the opposite sides of the equation, particularly during the Cold War, they've also managed to retain a form of respect and interaction, even during the Cold War era, where Turkey was guarding the eastern and the southern front of the alliance. The heavy industry in Turkey was developed by the Soviet Union at the time. So there's always been a little bit of this engagement with the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union at the time as a regional reality, as a historical reality, which is one of the main arguments that Turkey would make in terms of its necessity, despite all of the challenges and the seeming inconsistencies, to engage with the Russian Federation and with Moscow. But of course, I think in the past couple of years, particularly with the acquisition of the S-400 air missile defense system, with the burgeoning civilian nuclear engagement and cooperative scheme that Turkey has with Russia, and then with the operational engagements, despite the fact that they're pitted on opposite sides of the equation in places like Syria, has raised a lot of questions. The challenge now, I think, is given the state of affairs in Ukraine, the perception of the Russian Federation and the regime under President Putin in Russia, this engagement and interaction with the Russian Federation is increasingly burdensome for Turkey. And I think that will be an increasing challenge. Hopefully the war will not go long, but if it is prolonged, then it will be something that Turkey will have increasing difficulty to rationalize.
So what about Turkey's bilateral relationship with Ukraine prior to the war? Is this these two nations that have a lot of points of contact, or are they sort of just coexisting?
It was a very burgeoning and developing relationship. As I said, particularly since 2014, Turkey has been very supportive of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And you see the fact that the Ukrainians recognize this, and they also recognize the fact that despite the certain exposures that Turkey has to the Russian Federation, even in these circumstances, Turkey has been able to stand up in terms of its principled attitude, if you will, to support Ukraine. And there was a burgeoning relationship that also saw the two countries signing agreements to enhance their defense cooperation. I was talking to the Ukrainian ambassador in Turkey the other day, and he was telling me that nowadays a lot of young boys that are born in Ukraine will be named after the Bayraktar drone that Turkey had sold to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have been using with great efficiency. He also joked to say that the girls will be called Javelina. So this is really a very complex relationship.
You mentioned the drone, the Bayraktar, and I don't think much of it is a first name, but I do know that it is a very effective tool in the Ukrainian arsenal as they combat the Russian invasion.
The TB2 has seen action in Libya, and it's been successfully used by Azerbaijan and featured in its military victory parade.
I know you've done some work on these combat drones. It's not the first time we've seen them be highly effective. I know they're part of the conflict in Libya, for example. Has Turkey just suddenly become a drone superpower? And what kind of momentum is Turkey seeking to build for their investment in these drones and their deployment?
Well, Turkey's made significant progress in this area. There's no doubt about that. And I think what has allowed Turkey to catch a niche, if you will, in this in this important, I'll call it a market, is that it's been able to produce a very efficient drone where the unit price is a lot lower than its competitors. And when you speak about potential rivals in this regard, it's the United States, it's China, it's Israel, and it's Turkey. Basically, those four nations are the ones that are sort of competing for this market in that domain. And Turkey's been able to provide this drone. But what I think makes it stand out particularly is the fact that the Bayraktar drone has proven its operational worthiness in very diverse operational theaters, ranging from Syria to Libya to the Southern Caucasus, and now in Ukraine. And, when you speak to defense analysts, the point they make is that, and we see this in the case of Ukraine as well, that most of the countries that have bought the Bayraktar seem to have analyzed and studied very well the previous experiences that the Bayraktar has gone through in different operational theaters. For example, when you look at the situation in Ukraine, they've used it differently compared to the way in which the Azerbaijanis used it against the Armenians in the war around Nagorno-Karabakh, in the sense that the Ukrainians were defending territory, not trying to capture it. And what they targeted were the logistic supply lines of the Russian Federation that were already extended and vulnerable. So when you look at the way in which that countries that have purchased the Bayraktar are employing it in operational theaters, it seems that either through cooperation with Turkey or simply by studying the way in which Turkey has been using it, they are also mimicking Turkey's concept of operations and are adapting it to their own environments. And I think the Ukrainians have done a successful job in that regard.
Besides supplying drones to the Ukrainian armed forces, Turkey also took a big move that could be read as a confrontation in Russia to close off access to the Turkish Straits. How significant was that decision?
Yeah, that was, I think, in addition to the fact that Turkey called Russia's action a war, the second, maybe most important step that Turkey took was to decide to close down the transit of warships from Russia, and as the other quote-unquote warring party of Ukraine from the Turkish Straits. And this was an important decision. It was historical in the sense that it's only the second time in the history of the Montreux Convention, which is the regime that governs passage through these straits, of which Turkey is the custodian. It's only the second time in its history that this article has been invoked. The other instance was during World War II. And the specific article, Article 19, that bestows that right upon Turkey, allows Turkey as a non-belligerent party to close down passage of warships from countries that are at war. So this was a very important decision on the part of Turkey, also confirming the fact that it regards the action in Ukraine as being a state of war.
Montreux Sözleşmesi'nin
And how has Russia reacted to Turkey's move to close the straits?
Russia, as far as I know, I haven't seen any official negative reaction to this decision on the part of Turkey. This still gives Russia the right to bring back vessels that may belong to the Black Sea Fleet, but that may be deployed outside of the Black Sea into the Black Sea domain. But of course, it's significant in multiple respects. First, of course, because of its political connotation. Second, in terms of depriving Russia the ability to supplement its forces through the straits by outside supply. And third, indirectly, it has also deprived Russia the ability to sustain its forces and presence in Syria, which it was doing very much through naval support through the Black Sea.
Bir an önce ateşkesin ve barışın sağlanması herkesin faydasına olacaktır.
So it seems like Turkey really wants to be a peacemaker here, and obviously they're hosting these diplomatic negotiations. How do you think they're going so far?
Well, first of all, Turkey's incentive is obvious. As a regional actor, you do not want a state of war in your neighborhood. This is affecting everyone on a global scale, but it has more direct implications for Turkey. Just to give a simple example, the minute there's war in the neighborhood, the tourism industry in Turkey is crippled. And when you think of the fact that 30% of the tourists that come to Turkey actually come from Russia and Ukraine traditionally, you see the problem in Turkey's hands. And that, of course, is nothing compared to the tragedy that the Ukrainians are suffering. But from a Turkish perspective, that is a problem, obviously. Now, as far as I can understand, there's still the verdict is still out on how this might end. But what's important is that both Russia and Ukraine, particularly after the meeting in Istanbul, made the point that the atmosphere there had been the most, I'm not sure what the right word would be to characterize it, but that it's been different from all the other previous meetings that they've had. And the Ukrainians did make the point that one of the most important achievements in terms of having the meetings in Turkey, and particularly that one in Istanbul, was that the negotiation process had moved out of Belarusia. And obviously, I think from a NATO standpoint, from a Western standpoint, irrespective of all of the difficulties that Turkey may have with its allies in its bilateral relationship here and there, I think it's important that Turkey is hosting these meetings and that Turkey is able to, up until this point, I think, retain its good standing both with Moscow and with Ukraine, because this continues to provide, despite all of the egregious violations of humanitarian law and everything else that we see in Ukraine, it continues to provide the off-ramp that eventually we will need, that Ukraine and Russia will need. Is it a stalling tactic on the part of the Russians to have this process ongoing? That risk might be there. But even if that is the case, I think it's understandable for Turkey to continue to provide its facilitation, if you will, services in this regard, so long as the Ukrainians want this to continue. And that does seem to be the case.
I'll be right back to ask Alper about Turkey's domestic politics, its history with Russia, and its future with NATO and Europe. Hey, thanks for listening to The World Unpacked. If you're enjoying the show, leave us a rating and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. So Turkey's a NATO member. It's supplying Ukraine with lethal weapons, including the Bayraktar drone we mentioned. It closed off the Turkish Straits. It's blocking Russian warships' access to and from the Black Sea. But at the same time, it has opposed Western sanctions on Russia, and it's given Russian oligarchs a safe haven. How do they balance that? How do they find that middle ground? Is that working as a policy for them and keeping both sides happy?
Yeah, that's a good point. First of all, in terms of sanctions, the Turkish psyche in relation to sanctions is different. The only sanctions that Turkey recognizes are those that are endorsed by the UN Security Council. Turkey has its own history of being sanctioned, foremost by the United States in the past, and currently that is also the case in terms of the Qatar sanctions that are being applied towards Turkey. So it has a very distant stance towards extraterritorial sanctions of that nature. That's the background from which Turkey acts when it comes to sanctions of this nature. In the context of Russia and the sanctions that are being applied, Turkey is not necessarily opposing the sanctions, but it is not joining them. But while it hasn't joined them, it has taken certain steps, in addition to the fact that it's supplying arms and supporting Ukraine politically and in other means. But while it's kept its airspace open for civilian traffic from the Russian Federation, despite the fact that it's been closed by its NATO allies, Turkey has closed its airspace to Russian military flights. And I recently inquired and confirmed that it's also closed its airspace to Russian civilian flights to Syria because of the potential of Russia of using that line of communication to bring in foreign fighters, which was an issue that had come up, as you know. So despite the fact that it hasn't officially joined, if you will, the sanctions regime, it is doing its part, as far as I understand, in certain domains, as I outlined. Now, as far as the oligarchs are concerned, I think Turkey is being very careful not to be perceived as a safe haven for oligarchs. The exception that comes to mind, I think, is Abramovich, who has been sanctioned by the EU and the UK, but not necessarily by the United States. And he has a particular role that has been recognized by both President Zelensky and by the Russian side. He's been acting as a go-between Russia and Ukraine, and it was actually the Ukrainians who took the step and asked for him not to be sanctioned. And he was present in the meetings in Istanbul as well. So I think Turkey is not necessarily opening its doors to all oligarchs, but it is trying to not be seen as a safe haven for those oligarchs that have been sanctioned by everyone, but is keeping an open door to, in the case of Abramovich, someone who could be instrumental in mending fences between Russia and Ukraine.
Mass graves and bodies in the streets of Kyiv, the suburb of Bucha, tell a story.
And we all watched in horror as the images and video and footage from the satellites came out of Bucha and the horrible atrocities committed by the Russian forces there. This looks like a turning point for the Europeans, and we already saw Lithuania cut off gas and energy trade with Russia. We may see other European nations follow suit. How is this playing in Turkey, and will this mark a change in their policy as well?
I think the war in Ukraine had already become a moment of truth for everyone, but the scenes coming out of Bucha have aggravated that notion. I do agree with what you say. This is further changing the tide in the way in which the global conscience will be looking at what's going on in Ukraine. And I think everyone, including Turkey, will have to reconsider a lot of things. We've seen significant paradigm shifts as a result of this war. And I would expect a similar paradigm shift to occur in Turkey as well.
We already talked a little bit about the S-400. That was a big deal during the Trump administration. It continued to be during the Biden administration, basically up until the invasion of Ukraine. That's a weapons system that the Turks wanted to buy from the Russians that threatened the sale of some American-made fighter jets as part of their NATO membership. Can you tell us where that deal is now following the war in Ukraine?
Right. Well, Turkey did purchase the S-400 air and missile defense system from the Russian Federation. Turkey's argument at the time was that it was an urgent need for Turkey, which, based on the threat perceptions that I was a part of at the time as well, was a reality and a fact at the time. At this point in time, it's fair to say that it was a mistake to purchase the S-400s. It's become a big burden for Turkey, and Turkey now has that system. It's been sanctioned under CAATSA by the United States. It seems to be in a stalemate currently because Turkey has not operationalized the system, which I believe in itself is an important signal, one that I think should be carefully scrutinized in DC, because while Turkish officials continue to make the point that they may continue to buy weapons from the Russian Federation, that is more of flexing political muscle and making the point that we will not be told what we can buy and what we cannot buy. But in practice, the fact that it has not bought additional systems, the fact that it has not operationalized the S-400 are, in my view, very important signs. And an even more important sign, in my view, is the fact that Turkey recently approached the United States with a request to buy 40 F-16s, the latest version of that, and 80 renewal kits for its existing fleet. That is very important in the sense that despite the S-400 acquisition and the flirtation, if you will, between Turkey and the Russian Federation in various areas, it signals, as far as I'm concerned, Turkey's desire to remain in the NATO and Western defense industry ecosystem, which is why I think it would be very important for this, hopefully not to be politicized when being assessed on the U.S. side, and that the Biden administration would support this request.
We know here in the U.S. that inflation is a huge political albatross around Joe Biden's presidency. It's not even close to the rate we're seeing in Turkey. I read that it's 61% annual inflation. That's a 20-year high. The economic situation in Turkey is dire, as it is around the world, but especially, I think, with President Erdogan sort of having been in power quite a long time and trying to maintain support. How is the domestic Turkish political and economic situation playing into the balance and diplomacy on Russia and Ukraine?
You saved the easiest question towards the last. Thank you for that. I just came back from Turkey. I was there for a couple of meetings, and I took a lot of taxi rides, and that's where you can really get the scoop on the street. I don't remember hearing so many people complain about the economic circumstances and then go on with a political comment afterwards. That was not necessarily supportive of the current government and its policies. I think that is a significant challenge. But of course, the numbers in Turkey are staggering. And it is further aggravated by the fact that because of these unorthodox policies that Turkey embarked upon towards the end of last year, the Turkish lira has depreciated over 80%. So now you have a purchasing power that has diminished. You have inflation at roughly 100%. The only breath of fresh air that the Turkish economy was hoping for going into the summer, which would have been tourism, particularly from Russia and Ukraine, has also been undermined. So the state of economy is extremely challenging, which is another incentive, I believe, and another reason why Turkey has, both in terms of its foreign policy posturing, taken a more conciliatory approach as of late. It is trying to mend fences with a lot of regional countries that it has fallen out with. You see Turkey being more patient in its continuing disagreements with Greece. You see the engagement between Turkey and Israel, and Turkey is also trying to develop its relations and to build back trust, I think, with the United States. What we see is Turkish foreign policy calibrating itself to the new reality in the world and in the region. And I think one of the reasons for that in Turkey's case is the state of the economy. We have elections coming up in 2023. It doesn't seem to be the case that the government will be able to pull out an economic miracle out of its hat. The only thing I think it may be able to pull out is a stable foreign policy where Turkey can posture itself as a reliable international actor and possibly try and sell that, if you will, to the Turkish public in a manner that would make them feel proud. So that's why I think this recalibration in Turkish foreign policy overall is something that will probably continue as we lead into elections next year.
I want to stay with this theme of the recalibration because at one point in my lifetime, a lot of the talk about Turkey was, are they going to be able to join the European Union? And then recently it's been, are they going to leave NATO, right? I mean, it's all a little hyperbolic, but I think you can see that swing back and forth. In the short term, they're calibrating to try to balance the US, Russia, the West, and everything. But over the long term, do you see Turkey as claiming this sort of buffer zone middle path, or do you think they will once again lean towards the West?
That's also an interesting question. And I've always made the point that despite the perception of Turkey and despite the obvious development of its relations, intensification of its interaction, I don't call it cooperation, I call it interaction because in many instances, it's an engagement with a competitive nature with the Russian Federation. So despite all of those developments, one thing Turkey has done is it's retained its standing within the alliance in terms of its contributions, both financially and in terms of NATO's military undertakings, its operations and missions. There's been a lot of oscillation in terms of Turkey's relationship with its allies, and Turkey's had its own grievances as well. You talk about the EU full membership process. I've been indirectly involved in that, and despite the fact that I'm a big advocate for Turkey's future with the European Union, I'm also quite upset with the way in which Turkey's been treated in that process. Clearly, Turkey hasn't done a lot of things right, and clearly there are a lot of things that Turkey needs to do. But I think, in terms of where Turkey will continue to stand, it's never really left the Western cap in practice, though the political rhetoric has often signaled that. And that has been coupled with an increasing grievance, I think, on the part of the Turkish public opinion that, particularly in its fight against terrorism, which has been a leading priority for Turkey, that its allies have not been as sensitive as Turkey would have wished them to be. When it comes to the fight against ISIS and Daesh, that was prioritized, whereas Turkey's own challenges were seen to be of secondary nature. And that has created a visceral discontent among the Turkish public opinion towards the West and its allies. And in an era of, populist rhetoric, that is the tool at the hands of every politician, that has been that potential has been tapped into by the political leadership in Turkey. So I don't see that as a conclusive situation in Turkey in which it is moving away. But this lack of trust, this erosion of trust is real. It needs to be addressed. And what I see in Turkey is, for this or for that reason, the current government wants to try and rebuild that, because I think it sees it as a tool that it can benefit from going into the elections next year. So there might be an opportunity to turn the tide, in my view.
I want to return to the conversation around the war in Ukraine. Right now, it seems like the Ukrainian forces are ascendant. Russia's retreated from Kyiv. They're refocusing on the Donbass, if you can believe the Russian military leadership. There's a huge range of scenarios from the end of Putin's reign to the total annexation of Ukraine by the Russian forces that could result after months or even years of conflict here. What does Turkey want to see as the final outcome of the Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, first of all, it wants it to end as soon as possible in a selfish manner that serves Turkey's interests without doubt. But in terms of what it wants overall, I think, when you look at the Turkish approach to principles such as territorial integrity, sovereignty, and viability of borders, it would stand up and support the full territorial integrity of Ukraine. Obviously, it will be up to the Ukrainians to decide what kind of a solution will satisfy them. We've heard President Zelensky make the point that his priority is saving lives. And when you look at some of the suggestions that Ukraine has made in terms of how peace may be made with the Russian Federation, it's clear that he's ready to take steps to satisfy the Russian expectations. According Ukraine neutrality is one of them. Deferring the solution of the situation in Crimea and Donbass is another one. So Turkey will very much follow Ukraine's cue in this regard, as long as the legitimate government is Ukraine is the one that makes the call. But I think Turkey would be very supportive of Ukraine's overall territorial integrity and its right to determine its future as it so wishes. Turkey's traditionally been one of the most vocal supporters of both Ukraine and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, much more so than some of its European allies have. That was before the war, and it continues today. So I think it will be up to Ukraine, and Turkey will be supportive of that position without doubt.
Alper, thanks for coming on the show and explaining Turkey's position on the war in Ukraine.
Thanks for having me, Doug. I appreciate it.
Hey, thanks so much for listening. We want to hear from you, so email us at podcasts@ceip.org. And you can find me on Twitter at Douglas L. Farrer. That's Farrar. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button and leave us a review or a rating. The World Unpacked is produced by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Our audio engineer is Tim Martin, and our executive producers are Cliff Jayapranada and Clarissa Guerrero.